It's 4:47 a.m. Moscow Standard Time, February 24th, 2022. In the Kremlin war room, senior Russian officers stand frozen in front of a tactical display that shows something they never expected to see. The plan that took 3 years to construct, the invasion strategy that Putin personally approved, has already begun collapsing. But not because of Ukrainian resistance, not because of NATO intervention, not because of American weapons or European resolve. The real catastrophe happened 72 hours before the first tank crossed the border. Most breakdowns of the 2022 invasion focus on tactical failures, poor logistics, underestimated Ukrainian morale, the collapse of the Kyiv encirclement. Those are symptoms, not causes. The actual collapse of the Russian offensive began before the first missile launched, before the first soldier crossed into Ukrainian territory. It began in the signals. Russia's entire operational plan depended on one foundational assumption: Ukraine's command and control would disintegrate within hours. Intelligence assessments predicted that once the initial strikes landed, once the shock of invasion registered, the Ukrainian government would fracture. President Zelensky would flee. The military chain of command would go dark. Confusion would paralyze resistance. Within 7 hours, Moscow believed Ukraine would be strategically decapitated. That assumption was bulletproof, on paper. But Russia made a catastrophic intelligence error. Not about weapon systems or troop strength, about information warfare itself. In 2021, Ukrainian military intelligence conducted one of the most sophisticated counterintelligence operations of the decade. They didn't announce it. They didn't advertise it. They simply identified Russian sleeper agents embedded inside Ukraine's government and military structures. People positioned specifically to execute sabotage during the opening hours of an invasion. These weren't random operatives. These were deep cover agents placed years in advance, meant to transmit targeting data, disable communications infrastructure, and spread disinformation designed to accelerate governmental collapse. Ukraine did something extraordinary with this knowledge. They didn't arrest them all immediately. That would have tipped off Moscow that the network was compromised. Instead, they selectively fed them false information. They allowed certain communications to flow through while blocking others. They created a mirror intelligence environment where Russian command believed they were receiving genuine battlefield data, reports of Ukrainian military fragmentation that didn't exist, confirmations of successful strikes that missed their targets, intelligence suggesting that the government was in chaos when it remained intact. For weeks before the invasion, Russian generals received reports that Ukraine's defenses would crumble in hours. These reports weren't coming from distant analysts. They were coming from their own people on the ground. Embedded agents, trusted sources. The intelligence felt ironclad because it was channeled through supposedly secure networks that Russia believed remained uncompromised. Russia built its entire opening strategy around information that was systematically false. The invasion launched at 4 a.m. on February 24th. By 6:30 a.m., Russian airborne forces were moving toward Hostomel Airport, a critical objective north of Kyiv. The plan called for a rapid seizure, establishment of an airhead, and the flow of thousands of airborne troops to secure the capital. This wasn't a slow attrition strategy. This was a kinetic blitzkrieg designed to achieve overwhelming force concentration before Ukrainian defenses could organize. But the airborne assault depended entirely on one thing: surprise and speed, predicated on the assumption that Ukraine's anti-air defenses would either be destroyed in opening strikes or rendered ineffective by command confusion. The real situation was radically different. Ukrainian air defense crews weren't confused. They weren't receiving conflicting orders. They weren't paralyzed by rumors of governmental collapse. They were at combat readiness because Ukrainian military leadership knew exactly what was coming. They knew the timing. They knew the targets. They knew where Russian aircraft would approach from. Because Russia's embedded intelligence sources had been feeding them that information for weeks. A Russian Il-76 transport aircraft carrying paratroopers approached Hostomel Airport at 04:47 a.m. The pilot believed the airfield was secure. Russian intelligence reports, fed through compromised channels, indicated that air defenses in the area had been suppressed. The pilots received no warnings. They flew on a trajectory that should have been safe. Then Ukrainian air defense systems activated. A Buk surface-to-air missile battery, positioned days earlier specifically for this moment, locked onto the transport plane. The missile accelerated upward at supersonic speeds. The Il-76 never had a chance to respond. The aircraft was destroyed with dozens of paratroopers still aboard. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the morning, Russian aircraft approached targets that they believed were vulnerable, having received false intelligence confirming the suppression of air defenses. Ukrainian crews, operating with perfect awareness of Russian flight patterns and timing, were positioned to respond. By 7:15 a.m., Russia had lost multiple transport aircraft, several helicopters, and dozens of combat jets. The airhead at Hostomel, instead of being secured and expanded, was contested. Instead of thousands of paratroopers flowing into Kyiv, Russian forces were fighting for survival at an airfield that was supposed to be theirs by 05:30 a.m. Command confusion, however, cut both ways. Russian commanders in Moscow didn't understand why the operation was failing. The intelligence they were receiving suggested everything was proceeding according to plan. Local commanders were reporting success. The flow of false information meant that senior leadership was making strategic decisions based on a battlefield situation that didn't exist. By 8 a.m., a critical decision point arrived. Russian commanders faced a choice: escalate airborne operations to Hostomel with additional transport aircraft, or wait for ground forces to advance. The intelligence they possessed suggested that Ukrainian defenses were fragmenting, that governmental control was collapsing, that a decisive blow was still possible if they committed their reserves immediately. They chose escalation. More Il-76 transports launched. More helicopter gunships were committed. More forces were dedicated to an airhead that had transformed from a presumed strategic victory into an active combat zone. Russian commanders were essentially feeding reinforcements into a meat grinder because they believed, based on months of false intelligence, that the grinder would turn off if they just pushed a little harder. The reinforcements arrived. They were met with coordinated Ukrainian fire. More aircraft were lost. More casualties mounted. The airhead never became a true foothold. By 10 a.m., Russian command realized that something fundamental was wrong with the operational picture they were seeing. But by then, the cascade had begun. Critical hours had been wasted. Airborne forces that were supposed to encircle Kyiv had been consumed in the battle for Hostomel. Helicopter assets that were meant to assault the government quarter were instead being used to provide close air support for ground formations that were falling behind schedule. Anti-tank resources that should have been concentrated on the main axis of advance were scattered across multiple objectives because command believed they were fighting a collapsing adversary rather than a prepared defense. The 7-hour window that Russia believed it would have to seize the capital before Ukrainian defenses could organize was already closing by 7 a.m. What makes this counterintelligence operation particularly devastating is that it didn't require Ukraine to win any battles. It didn't require superior weapons or better tactics. It required Ukraine to understand Russian decision-making processes deeply enough to predict exactly what Russia would do, and then feed that psychology false information. Ukraine knew that Russian military culture emphasizes centralized control and belief in precise intelligence. Ukrainian commanders understood that Russian planners, once they committed to an operation, would tend to escalate rather than reassess. They knew that once the invasion began, Russian senior leaders would interpret setbacks through the lens of faulty intelligence rather than acknowledge that their operational picture was compromised. So they didn't just feed false information, they fed false information in patterns that reinforced Russian commanders' existing beliefs about Ukrainian weakness. If Ukraine had broadcast information saying, "Your forces will fail," Russian commanders would have been skeptical. But when Ukrainian operatives transmitted information through supposedly secure Russian channels saying, "Your forces are succeeding but face less resistance than expected if you commit additional forces," Russian commanders believed it because it came from their own networks. The first 7 hours of the invasion became a cascade of decisions made on false premises. Each decision reinforced the next. Each escalation was based on an operational picture that became progressively less accurate. By the time Russian command realized the extent of the deception, the military and psychological momentum had shifted irreversibly toward Ukraine. This is where the invasion actually failed, not in the tactical details, but in the information architecture that drove strategic decisions. The military historians will spend decades analyzing tank movements and force concentrations. But the actual decisive moment was February 21, 2022, 3 days before the invasion, when Ukrainian counterintelligence confirmed that their information warfare campaign had achieved total penetration of Russian command's intelligence picture. From that moment, the outcome was determined. Not guaranteed, but determined. Russia could still have achieved victory through overwhelming force and time, but they couldn't achieve it through the strategy they had planned, because the strategy was based on an enemy that didn't exist outside the screens in their war room. And there's actually a detailed operational breakdown of how Ukraine's counterintelligence service specifically identified, compartmentalized, and fed false information through these networks. If you want to understand the exact methodology they used, I've put together a comprehensive analysis that walks through the signals intelligence they collected, the psychological operations they designed, and the timing windows they exploited. You can find that breakdown in the description and in the pinned comment. It goes much deeper into the actual mechanics of how this deception was constructed. The broader lesson here is one that modern military planners are still grappling with. In an age where information warfare precedes kinetic warfare, the integrity of your command and control becomes more critical than the quantity of your weapons systems. Russia had overwhelming numerical advantages. Ukraine's advantage was in understanding how Russian decision-making would respond to a specific pattern of false intelligence. This wasn't a victory of Western technology or NATO support, because most of that arrived weeks after the invasion began. This was a victory of counterintelligence craft, psychological operations, and a deep understanding of how your adversary thinks. The invasion proceeded anyway, because once an operation of that scale is launched, momentum is nearly impossible to reverse immediately. But the 7-hour window where Russia believed it would achieve its objectives was lost in those first minutes when aircraft began falling and command realized their operational picture was fundamentally compromised. That's the silent collapse that happened before the audible one. That's the failure that determined everything that followed. But here's what almost nobody discusses when they analyze that opening phase. The human cost of discovering you've been outmaneuvered isn't measured in destroyed aircraft alone. It's measured in the split-second decisions made by pilots who suddenly realize they're flying into a prepared defense they were told wouldn't exist. It's measured in radio chatter, intercepted later, between commanders who understood, in real time, that their entire operational timeline had compressed from days into hours. One intercepted transmission from a Russian aviation officer, captured by Ukrainian signals intelligence, contained these exact words: "The situation is developing faster than intelligence predicted." This was a battlefield commander confronting the reality that the assumptions underlying his mission were obsolete before his aircraft even crossed the border. The psychological dimension of this matters because military operations, especially large-scale invasions, depend on a collective confidence that the plan is sound. Once that confidence fractures, it never fully repairs, even if you win individual engagements. The entire organizational structure begins to make different decisions. This is where the second wave of Russian failures emerged. Because while the first wave was dealing with the shock of air defense systems still functioning, the second wave, the transport aircraft carrying airborne troops meant to seize airfields and establish forward positions, was launching based on outdated intelligence. The commanders of those transport squadrons had received their final briefing hours earlier. They had no knowledge that the air defense network they were supposed to bypass was still active and still lethal. The Ilyushin Il-76, Russia's primary heavy transport aircraft, is an incredible machine for what it's designed to do: carry 130 paratroopers or massive quantities of cargo across vast distances. But it was designed for an era where air superiority could be established and maintained. It's not a low-altitude penetration platform. It flies slow, it flies high, and it flies in predictable patterns because cargo distribution and paratrooper insertion requires stability. When those transports began their approach to Hostomel Airport and other forward airfields, they were still operating under the assumption that Russian air defenses had cleared a corridor for them. They weren't told about the radar systems still functioning. They weren't told about the Buk and Tor systems that had repositioned. They were told, your corridor is clear, you have air superiority overhead, execute your insertion. Then they encountered the reality that the organizational hierarchy had failed to communicate. The losses from these transport operations exceeded anything the Russian military had experienced since the Soviet Union's collapse. In some cases, entire squadrons of Il-76s were eliminated. The paratroopers they carried never got the chance to establish the foothold they were supposed to hold. The entire operational architecture that depended on securing those airfields fell apart because the air defense network hadn't been neutralized the way the plan required. Now here's the critical insight that military planners still debate. Should the Russian command structure have delayed the operation once they realized their air campaign had failed to achieve its objectives in the first hours? Should they have paused the invasion, reassessed, and launched a second attempt with updated intelligence and revised tactics? The answer is, it was already too late. The moment the first aircraft took off and crossed the border, the invasion had entered a state where stopping it would have been more catastrophic than continuing it. You can't recall a military operation of that scale once it's launched. You can't tell 100,000 troops that they're standing down because the air campaign didn't work. You can't recall paratroopers mid-flight. You can't reverse the psychological and organizational momentum. So the Russian military continued with an operation that its highest-ranking officers knew was operationally compromised, all because reversing course would have meant admitting, to themselves, to their political leadership, and to their troops, that the entire plan was fundamentally broken. This is where the distinction between tactical failure and strategic failure becomes crucial. Tactically, Russia could claim some early successes. They advanced territory. They captured some objectives. But strategically, they had lost the information war before the kinetic war even began. Their opponent knew their plan better than they knew it themselves. The intelligence failure that created this situation was almost Soviet in its comprehensiveness. The Russian military's understanding of Ukrainian defensive preparations was so poor that their operational planning was based on assumptions that collapsed under minimal scrutiny. They assumed air defenses would be overrun. They assumed air superiority would be achieved. They assumed command and control centers would be destroyed. They assumed the resistance would be disorganized and poorly coordinated. Every single one of those assumptions was wrong. And the reason they were wrong wasn't because Ukrainian forces possessed some advanced technology that Russia didn't know about. It was because Ukrainian forces had repositioned, hardened their defenses, and distributed their command structure in ways that Russian intelligence, which was operating from outdated imagery and passive signal collection. The deeper failure was organizational. Russia's intelligence apparatus was structured in a way that made it vulnerable to exactly this kind of surprise. Multiple intelligence agencies competed with each other rather than integrating their analysis. Political pressure existed to confirm that the operation would succeed, creating incentives to dismiss contradictory evidence. And the final layer, the military planners who designed the operation had invested so much in its logic that integrating new intelligence would have required them to admit they'd built their plan on faulty assumptions. So when the first wave encountered resistance that wasn't supposed to be there, the organizational pressure was to integrate that resistance into the existing plan, rather than revise the plan itself. Officers in the field were told, the situation is temporary. Air superiority will be achieved. Continue the operation. This is a phenomenon that military historians call persistence under uncertainty, and it's usually a recipe for catastrophe. The first major engagement that exposed this persistence occurred around Antonov Airport, the largest transport hub near Kyiv. Russian forces had planned to land transport aircraft full of airborne troops and establish a staging area from which they could expand operations toward the capital. Ukrainian forces, understanding the plan from intelligence briefings, had positioned air defense systems specifically to counter this approach. When Russian transport aircraft began their approach, they flew directly into a prepared defense. The losses were immediate and overwhelming. Aircraft that were supposed to land safely were destroyed on approach. Aircraft that managed to land encountered Ukrainian forces waiting for them. The entire operation, which was supposed to establish a forward position that would allow Russian forces to expand toward Kyiv, collapsed before it could achieve critical mass. The paratroopers who managed to land faced a brutal choice: establish defensive positions and hope for reinforcement that wasn't coming, or attempt to fall back toward Russian lines. Many didn't survive long enough to make that choice. But the real significance of the Antonov Airport operation wasn't its immediate tactical outcome. It was what it revealed about the broader operational picture. Russian commanders realized, in that moment, that the entire operational sequence they'd planned was obsolete. The airfield was supposed to be secured and used as a staging area. Instead, It was a contested zone where forces were being pinned down and destroyed. This realization rippled through the Russian command structure. Other operations that depended on the Antonov operation succeeding had to be revised. Timeline adjustments cascaded through the organization. What was supposed to be a rapid seizure of key objectives became a grinding campaign where every position had to be fought for. The psychological impact on Russian troops was equally severe. Soldiers who had been told they would encounter minimal resistance suddenly found themselves in sustained combat. Supply lines that had been planned for a rapid operation had to adapt to a prolonged campaign. The entire organizational structure of the invasion force had been designed for a specific scenario, and that scenario was no longer operational reality. This is what most analysis misses when examining the opening phase. It wasn't just that Russia failed to achieve air superiority. It was that failing to achieve air superiority meant every downstream operation had to be modified in real time, under fire, with incomplete information and competing organizational pressures. Every decision made in those first 12 hours created cascading complications for decisions that had to be made in the subsequent weeks. And the organization that had to make those decisions was one that had been structured specifically to implement a plan that was no longer viable. So it was forced to improvise, and military organizations are fundamentally designed to be good at executing plans, not at adapting to complete plan failure. The Russian command structure faced a crisis that went far deeper than tactical failure. When the initial air campaign collapsed in those opening hours, it didn't just cost them aircraft and pilots. It fundamentally broke the decision-making apparatus that was supposed to govern the entire operation. Think about what was happening in real time inside those bunkers. At 4:47 a.m., commanders had expected air superiority to be established. By 6:15 a.m., they were receiving reports of losses they hadn't anticipated. By 8:30 a.m., the picture was becoming catastrophic. But the decision-making process wasn't built to absorb shock. It was built to execute. The Russian General Staff had organized the invasion around what military theorists call a command and control architecture. This means they had predetermined chains of authority, predetermined communication protocols, and most critically, predetermined decision trees. When situation X occurs, you execute response Y. When condition Z develops, you implement procedure Q. The entire system was built on the assumption that certain baseline conditions would hold. Air superiority was the baseline condition. The moment it vanished, the entire architecture became partially obsolete. Here's what this meant operationally. A commander at the division level had been given specific orders: advance along Route K toward the airfield, rendezvous with airborne units at grid reference 7842, establish a forward operating position by hour 12. These weren't suggestions. These were the components of a larger plan that depended on precise timing and coordination. But now those airborne units weren't arriving, because the transport aircraft that were supposed to carry them had been destroyed or forced to turn back. The airfield couldn't be defended the way it was supposed to be because the air defense network was partially degraded. The division commander still had their orders, but the operational conditions that made those orders executable had fundamentally changed. This created a classic military problem called mission creep without mission change. The original mission statement remained the same: secure the airport, maintain air superiority, encircle the capital. But the ways you were supposed to accomplish that mission were no longer viable. So units had to improvise while still operating under orders designed for a different reality. A regimental commander might decide to push forward even though air support wasn't available, because turning back and waiting contradicted their orders. They might commit reserves to cover a flank that was supposed to be protected by aircraft because the aircraft weren't there. Each of these decisions created new problems downstream. The organizational breakdown cascaded through multiple levels. Battalion commanders were receiving reports of higher-than-expected casualties because their units were operating without the air cover they were promised. They needed to modify their tactics, but modifying tactics required approval from regimental headquarters. Regimental headquarters was trying to implement a plan designed by the General Staff, a plan that was partially inoperative. This created a lag in the decision-making process. Officers at intermediate levels were forced into a position where they could see the problem clearly, but the solution required approval from above. And the people above them were also struggling with the same fundamental reality. The plan we prepared for is no longer the situation we face. What made this even more dangerous was that the Russian military culture, like most military cultures, emphasizes discipline and the execution of orders from above. It doesn't naturally reward improvisation or lateral thinking. An officer who decided to deviate significantly from their orders, even if the deviation made tactical sense, was gambling that their superiors would agree with their judgment. If they didn't agree, that officer could be held responsible for abandoning their mission. So instead, many commanders found themselves in a position where they were executing orders that no longer made complete sense, trying to make those orders work in a situation they weren't designed for, all while hoping that higher command would update the orders in real time to match reality. That hope was often disappointed. The communication system itself became a bottleneck. The Russian command structure relied on secure military telecommunications. When the volume of urgent traffic suddenly increased by an order of magnitude, the system became congested. Messages that should have taken 15 minutes to transmit and receive took an hour. By the time clarification arrived from higher command, the tactical situation on the ground had already changed again. This is why some units made decisions that seemed strange to outside observers. They weren't operating on bad information exactly. They were operating on outdated information that was correct when it was sent, but incorrect by the time it arrived. They were also operating on the last clear orders they had received, even though those orders no longer matched the operational environment. The supply and logistics apparatus faced parallel problems. The logistics plan had been built around the assumption that the initial airfields would be captured quickly and secured. Once secured, supplies could be moved forward more efficiently. But if the airfields weren't secured, if the air situation remained contested, then the entire logistics network had to operate under degraded conditions. Transport aircraft couldn't fly forward into unsecured airspace. Helicopters couldn't be used to deliver supplies to forward positions if enemy air defense was still active. Ground convoy routes that were supposed to be relatively safe became contested. The logistics officers who were responsible for keeping the invasion force supplied were suddenly facing a situation where their plan was inoperative, and they didn't have authority to fundamentally redesign the logistics network. That redesign had to come from higher authority. Meanwhile, back at the division and corps level, commanders were making decisions based on incomplete information about where their own units actually were. In the initial hours, the fog of war wasn't just a poetic concept, it was an operational reality that made clear decision-making nearly impossible. A corps commander might have received a report that a particular regiment had secured a bridge. That report might have been correct at 6:43 a.m. But by 8:15 a.m., when the corps commander received and processed that information and issued new orders based on it, the situation had changed. The bridge had been contested. The regiment's position was now different, and the orders, which were correct for the previous situation, were now sending units into a situation that didn't match the intelligence the orders were based on. This is a problem that every military faces, but it's particularly acute in the early hours of a military operation. The closer you are to the beginning of the operation, the more rapidly the situation changes. The more rapidly the situation changes, the less reliable any intelligence becomes. The less reliable the intelligence, the more dangerous it is to make major decisions based on it. Russian commanders were forced to make major decisions under these exact conditions. They had to decide whether to commit their reserves, whether to push certain units forward more aggressively, whether to reinforce positions that seemed threatened. Each decision had to be made with incomplete information, under time pressure, without the ability to wait for clearer intelligence to arrive. And crucially, they had to make these decisions knowing that the plan they were supposed to be executing was partially inoperative. That knowledge introduced psychological pressure that made clear thinking even harder. An officer who is confident in their plan can make decisions with a certain amount of psychological ease. An officer who knows the plan is failing has to make decisions under psychological stress, knowing that their decisions might compound the original failure. This is where we see the difference between a military that is prepared for the unexpected and a military that is not. The most effective military organizations build flexibility into their planning. They anticipate that the initial plan will encounter problems. They train their officers to adapt, to improvise, to modify tactics based on the reality they encounter. They push decision-making authority down to lower levels of command so that officers closer to the action can make changes without waiting for approval. The Russian military was organized differently. It emphasized the execution of orders from above more than the adaptive capacity of commanders below. This approach has advantages when the plan is correct and circumstances align with predictions. It has severe disadvantages when the plan encounters unexpected resistance and reality diverges from predictions. And so the opening hours of the operation revealed a fundamental organizational weakness that couldn't be fixed in real time. The structure that was supposed to coordinate a complex military operation was not flexible enough to adapt when the basic assumptions underlying the plan proved incorrect. By 11:30 a.m., roughly 5.5 hours into the operation, it became clear to Russian senior commanders that they were facing a crisis of coordination. Units were not where they were supposed to be. Operations that were supposed to proceed in parallel were falling out of synchronization. The air situation, rather than improving, was deteriorating. A commander at the general staff level had to make a decision. They could continue attempting to execute the original plan, knowing that conditions had changed. Or they could attempt to replan the operation, knowing that replanning would consume time and resources, while the enemy was actively defending. They could also attempt something in between, modify the plan incrementally, while maintaining the basic operational concept. They chose the third option, and that decision, made somewhere between hour 5 and hour 7, would shape everything that followed. What happened in that conference room was not a sudden collapse of Russian plans. It was something far more insidious. It was the slow-motion death of coordinated action. The officers knew the original schedule was already dead. Airborne units that should have seized airfields by dawn were now 12, 15, sometimes 20 kilometers behind schedule. Artillery that was supposed to suppress air defense had only partially succeeded. Helicopter assault formations that were meant to move deep into Ukrainian territory had suffered enough losses that their commanders were requesting fire support before pushing forward. So they issued new orders. Modify the plan, keep pushing forward, but adjust timelines. Consolidate gains where possible, accept delays where necessary. Press hard where you can achieve breakthrough. The problem was this. Every modification, every adjustment, created a cascade of secondary effects that no one had fully wargamed. When you move a helicopter assault unit's insertion time back 2 hours, the artillery unit that was supposed to suppress air defense in that sector has to shift its bombardment schedule. When you delay an airborne landing by 30 minutes, the ground units pushing north have to adjust their advance rate or risk overrunning their supporting fire. What was supposed to be one coordinated operation, a surgical strike with all pieces moving in precise synchronization, was now becoming something messier. It was becoming multiple separate operations, somewhat loosely connected, each fighting its own battle on its own schedule. By noon, some Russian units were still operating under the original timeline. Others had received updated orders. Some units received partial updates. A few units, cut off from communication, were still executing orders that had been superseded hours earlier. This is where the fog of war stops being an abstract concept and becomes a grinding, material problem. When you have paratroopers who are supposed to hold an airfield, but the air defense suppression unit that was supposed to protect them got delayed, what do? When you have mechanized infantry that's supposed to support an airborne operation, but they're still 3 kilometers away because the engineer unit clearing the road took casualties, what do? You adapt. You improvise. You do what every military does when the plan disintegrates. You fight with what you have, where you are, with whatever forces you can bring to bear. But adaptation takes time. It requires communication. It requires commanders to have accurate information about where their units actually are, what their actual strength is, and what they can realistically accomplish. Russian communication systems, even the most modern ones, were already struggling. The loss of relay stations and the degradation of communication satellites meant that some units had to use older, less secure systems. Some units were operating on different communication networks altogether, which meant orders from higher command couldn't reach them in real time. By 1:15 p.m., nearly 7 hours into the operation, the situation had solidified into something that was no longer a plan. It was a series of independent engagements happening across a massive geographic area, loosely coordinated by commanders who had incomplete information and were making decisions with significant time delays. This is the moment that separates successful military operations from failed ones. A successful operation has a commander who can see the whole battlefield and adjust it in real time. A failed operation has a commander who is trying to coordinate based on information that's always 20, 30, sometimes 50 minutes old. The Russian general staff had invested months in planning this operation. They had thought through thousands of contingencies. They had built redundancy into their communications. They had identified and solved dozens of tactical problems. But there was one problem they couldn't solve: the basic friction that emerges when you try to move 1,000,000 men and their equipment across a contested battlefield simultaneously. By mid-afternoon, the situation had crystallized further. Ukrainian reinforcements were arriving. Not the desperate, ragged counterattacks of the early hours, but coordinated divisional movements. Mobile defense units were setting up firing lines. Air defense was consolidating around new positions. And most importantly, Ukrainian command was operating on accurate, real-time intelligence about where Russian forces actually were. This asymmetry, where one side had accurate information about the other side's position, and the other side had degraded, delayed information, created a compounding disadvantage. A Russian commander trying to decide whether to push forward or consolidate position didn't actually know where his neighboring units were. A Ukrainian commander, receiving real-time intelligence from NATO allies, knew where Russian units were better than some Russian commanders did. It created a situation where the aggressor, which started with the advantage, was making decisions based on assumptions that no longer reflected reality, and the defender, which started at a disadvantage, was making decisions based on facts. The operational tempo that the Russians had been counting on to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses began to slow. Not because Russian soldiers were less brave or less committed, but because the information they were operating on was corrupted by delay, loss, and fog. By 2:30 p.m., the original operational objectives had shifted fundamentally. The airborne seizures that were supposed to be complete by dawn were still ongoing. The deep penetration by mechanized units that was supposed to reach certain positions by mid-morning was still hours away, if it was going to happen at all. The air superiority that was supposed to be established by hour 3 was still contested, with Ukrainian aircraft still operating in multiple regions. What had started as a narrow window of advantage, where Russian forces had concentration of force, surprise, and initiative, had widened back into a conventional battlefield where neither side had overwhelming advantage, but where one side, Ukraine, had better information and better coordination. This is what senior Russian commanders realized somewhere between hour 6 and hour 7. They were no longer fighting the battle they had planned to fight. They were fighting the battle that the fog of war, the resistance of the enemy, and the friction of their own system had created. And in that new battle, the Russian advantage was no longer crushing. It was marginal. It was a battle that could be lost. The decision made in that command room, to modify the plan rather than abandon it or recommit to it completely, was a decision to accept indefinite delay rather than accept immediate failure. It was a rational decision, but it was also a decision that conceded the initiative to the Ukrainian side. And once initiative passes in modern warfare, it's extraordinarily difficult to recapture. This is why the first 7 hours of that operation matter so much. Not because everything was decided in those hours, many more months of fighting would follow, but because in those 7 hours, the window of operational advantage that Russia had carefully constructed closed. The element of surprise was gone, the coordination of forces was degraded, the assumption of rapid victory had been falsified, and the momentum had shifted from the side that had started the operation to the side that had been forced to defend. For those who want a deeper breakdown of exactly which units failed to meet their objectives, how the Ukrainian intelligence network operated in real time to identify breaches in Russian coordination, and what the long-term implications of this early failure were for the rest of the conflict, I've put together a comprehensive analysis in the description and in the pinned comment. That resource goes into the specific commander decisions, the communication failures, and the tactical consequences that shaped everything that followed. The larger lesson here is something that strategists have been trying to communicate for decades. Speed and coordination matter more than raw force in the opening hours of conflict. A larger force that is slower to coordinate is more vulnerable than a smaller force that moves faster. A commander with complete information is more effective than a commander with more resources but less intelligence. Russia had invested enormous resources into this operation, but they could not solve the basic problem of military operations. How do you move a massive force across contested territory while maintaining coordination? The answer, as it turned out, was that you cannot completely solve that problem. You can only minimize it through meticulous planning, redundancy, and flawless execution. Russian planning was meticulous. Redundancy was built in. But execution, human execution, in the face of enemy resistance and unexpected circumstances, could not be flawless. And that small gap between flawless execution and what actually happened was enough to transform an operation that looked, on paper, like a surgical victory, into something far messier and far more uncertain. That's the story of the first 7 hours. Not a dramatic collapse, but the slow realization that a perfectly planned operation encounters a perfectly human enemy, defending perfectly effectively, using the friction of war itself as a weapon. If you want to understand how those initial failures cascaded into months